Just give me a minute to get this thing going here. Okay, that's what I didn't want. Okay, I need that. Let's see, document camera. We'll go back to PC. Shot. I should rate. Okay. Yeah, this my little monitor's not working right on my podium, so I'm having to look far away to see what I'm trying to open. So it's a little bit awkward. So just hang with me. I think I can make this work. Okay, we'll go like that. Okay, so welcome. Here we are, physiology, Tuesday morning. This is chapter 4 or 5, probably 5 on your book. And this is probably one of the more interesting ones that I like. There's really 2 things you have to pay attention to for this presentation. This unit is rate and force, up and down. It's very binary. And I'm going to, let's see, I want to go to this one slide. That's not the slide I wanted. Let's see. There's one slide that kind of summarizes everything. Here we go. So when you look at all of the things we're going to talk about today, we talk about things that are going to make your heart rate go up and things that are going to make your heart rate go down. And then on the next, I have it set into 2, one's rate and one's force, 2 presentations, but you'll get them as one on your modules. Maybe I can't even see that. At any rate, that's a really good study page because that kind of tells you everything that's going to go on. And we're going to talk about all these variations about things that relate to your nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. How does your brain connect to your heart for breathing, for oxygen, for CO2, various drugs, how they might interact. There's something called the Bainbridge reflex, which deals with volume of blood. When you take a breath in, volume of blood comes back into your right heart, and that triggers a bunch of responses. So we'll take a look at that. And then we'll flip over to the other side and look at things that regulate force. So your body's kind of like, your heart's supposed to deliver the blood supply that you need for maintaining your functions, be it at rest or at exercise or different metabolic activities like after you eat. And so what are all the wiring systems? Some of them are wiring when you think about nerves, but some of them are also chemical signals. What are the signals your body uses to tell your heart what it needs? And then interesting, what do we do if your heart is not connected to wires at all? Think about a patient who had a heart transplant. They have a denervated heart. When they put a new heart in you, they connect the pulmonary veins, the pulmonary artery, the vena cava, and the aorta. They don't connect the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So there's no wiring to your brain. So how does your heart regulate itself absent the brain? And it does. So we'll talk about that. So let's go back to this slide. Okay. Actually, I have these right here so I can kind of see. There we go. No signal. Oh, well, okay. So we want to take, I was just talking about how your heart is connected to your body and it's trying to meet the needs of your body. And the cardiac output is what its job is to produce, and that's a function of heart rate times stroke volume. We learned that in our hemodynamics class last quarter, and you can use either ones to get to the goal. And we'll talk about these things. I just kind of reviewed that. This is the first slide of content. So you have a group of volunteers that talks about 10 healthy young men, and those, yeah, and somebody's got their mute. You might as well mute yourself because we're hearing background chat from somebody out there. Welcome, everybody who's out there in Zoom land. Glad to have you, but let's mute it up unless you want to ask a question. So these are 10 healthy young men, which what it means is 10 medical students who took the $20 to take these two drugs and let them instrument them and see what happened. That's what that means. It doesn't say that, but that's in between the lines. How much would it take to get these guys to let them knock out their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems? Maybe it's more than $20. I don't know. But what they did, these are control groups. So they did two different groups and they're giving you atropine. What's that going to do to you? They give you atropine. It increases your heart rate because it knocks out your brakes. It knocks out the parasympathetic system. So these guys' heart rate went up to like 110, 115. And then they gave them propranolol. What is that drug? What does that do? Beta blocker. That's a beta blocker. So that basically knocks out the sympathetic. The beta receptor sites on the surface of the heart are no longer responsive. So there's no more sympathetic signals getting to the heart. So they end up coming back to a heart rate of 100. So for the other group of them, they gave them the beta blocker first, and their heart rate went from a resting rate of 60 down to 50. And then they knocked out the brakes and they went back up. Oddly or interesting or not surprisingly, both groups came to the same basic heart rate. So this is what your heart rate would be at rest if you had a transplanted heart. That would be where your body wants to be. If you cut all the wiring out, that's where your heart's going to run. That's the engine idle with no input signal from the brain, from the CPU. So then you think, I'll jump ahead since I mentioned it. How do you think the body regulates? How does it regulate itself? What's its main way of regulating its cardiac output if it doesn't have any wiring to the brain? What can it do? I'll give you a hint. It's going to be found on the next set of slides, which is all about force. Okay, you guys think? Nope. You guys think about that. Go ahead. Somebody has a guess.
Sympathetic and the parasympathetic with epinephrine and acetylcholine?
Well, you could try using those drugs, but you can't be giving yourself those shots every time you want to try to go up a flight of stairs. So this is how your heart would regulate itself without connection to the brain. And you start walking, you start exercising, the heart needs to put more cardiac output out, but what can it do? It becomes this venous return starts changing when you start walking. We'll get into that in a cardiac output unit in a couple of weeks, but it has to do with venous return to your heart. So someone said Bainbridge, so that's kind of close. I'll answer it. Starling. Starling's law will be how your heart can regulate itself. That's an extrinsic function, which means outside of the brain, extrinsic function. Okay, next slide. So these are the wirings. There's sympathetic. It uses epinephrine, norepinephrine. It spreads out over the heart. The sympathetic nervous system spreads out over the heart. There's beta 1 receptor sites all over the heart, and these are like a web around the heart. And when the brain sends a signal, it gets to the whole heart quickly. Parasympathetic uses acetylcholine. And these are some graphs that would show what happens if we manipulate. There's a right and left stellate ganglion. Don't worry too much about these. But the sympathetic, the left side has to do with force, inotropic state, and the right side of the nervous system, the right branch coming out of the right down your right side is rate. On the parasympathetic, the left branch is AV node wired and the right branch is SA node wired. So the wiring goes to different places in the heart from the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And this is kind of interesting, not a big surprise, I guess, when you think about it. I think I introduced drugs and sympathetic, parasympathetic, and I related it to gas pedal and brake pedal, didn't I, maybe? Where if you put on the gas on your car, it takes a little while for the acceleration to kick in. And this is what happens when they did a 20 hertz stimulation, 20 times per second over 30 seconds of the sympathetic nerves of an instrumented animal. And then the heart rate would rise slowly. And then when they stop the stimulation, it tapers off slowly. So this is like you hit the gas on your car, it accelerates, it's running. You stop, let off the gas, and now you're coasting down the road, and slowly the speed will degrade. So the sympathetic comes on a little slow, goes off a little slow. But the parasympathetics, like the brakes, when they put the 7 cycles per second for 22 seconds here, the rate was here. As soon as they hit the parasympathetic, boom, the rate dropped way down. And as soon as they let off, the rate jumped right back up. So that's just telling you that parasympathetic is very fast acting. And these are baroreceptors. So this is talking about how does your heart know from the brain what to do with blood pressure? Because that's an important thing, managing blood pressure. So you have these pressure receptors in your body. They're in your carotid arch, right, or the carotid bulbs. They're in your aortic arch, and they're also in the walls of your LV. So they're like in 3 places mainly. And if you have high blood pressure, the brain says, hey, I don't want that pressure up here. So it'll reduce the sympathetic tone and increase the parasympathetic tone to slow down the heart rate to lower the pressure. Conversely, if you have low blood pressure, the brain wants pressure to itself, so it'll make your heart go faster and stronger also, and give you more pressure. So this is the baroreceptors are all about keeping the pressure in the brain where it likes it. So the brain will override the body's needs to satisfy its own needs. The brain is kind of selfish. It's preserving itself. Okay. And this is just showing you sympathetic and parasympathetic. There's vagal activity, and they're inversely related. They go against each other. That's what that shows you. This is something called the Bainbridge reflex, and this has to do with a volume of blood coming into the right atrium, and it causes a right atrial stretch. And we all know about Starling's law. If you stretch it, it kicks harder. In the right atrium, a couple other things happen. If you stretch the right atrium, it tells the brain, hey, we got a big load of volume here. We got to move that out. So it increases the heart rate, which is this one, increased right atrial pressure. And so it stimulates these atrial receptors, and the Bainbridge reflex is to elevate heart rate. So that's what happens. It also releases a peptide. It's called atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. And that's what's in the print at the bottom of the slide. And that tells your body, hey, I've got a lot of volume in my right atrium, and I need to get rid of the volume. So it stimulates diuresis. So for a short period of time, that's not going to be very important. But if you are always having a stretched out right heart, that means you're probably in right heart failure. It's always stretched out. It didn't get rid of its volume. And so the diuresis will help unload the volume. Another thing that's clinically useful with this atrial natriuretic peptide is we can measure that in your blood plasma. And if you have a consistent reading of A and P in your plasma, that tells the cardiologist that your heart is in failure. It's all stretched out. So they will watch that as a sign of heart failure. If they see A and P in your blood, that means your body says, hey, man, I'm stretched out here. So that lets them know to start managing you for heart failure. The body recognizes it's in a failure state. So all these things will make elevated heart rate. But if we keep doing that, well, then we end up over here. We don't need to be running on high heart rate. So the bottom side of this, there's all these checks and balances. Your body's got all this homeostatic mechanisms because it wants to be in the happy place in the middle. It wants to be at a heart rate of 60. It wants a pH 7.35. It wants a CO2 of 35. And It wants an oxygen of partial oxygen pressures of about, it wants sats about 95, and it'll do everything it can to get itself back in that happy place in the middle. Temperature, it wants 98.6, and these narrow ranges are where we operate. So if you have things that make it go up, then there's other countermeasures that will balance it out. Like if you increase the right atrial pressure, you get increased cardiac output via Starling's law, because you stretch it, it kicks harder. That leads to intra-arterial pressure that rises. Then those baroreceptors in your carotid bulbs and your aortic arch, they will tell your brain to slow down the heart rate, the baroreceptor reflex. So those are typically to tell you to slow down if you have a high pressure. So these things all balance out. So if I ask you what the Bainbridge reflex is, that's the right atrium's response to a volume load. It stretches out, it sends out signals saying, hey, speed up the heart rate, let's move this volume through, and it releases a diuretic. That's the Bainbridge response. It's the right atrium managing your heart rate all by itself. These are homeostasis efforts, this meaning the body's trying to get itself into the happy place of, here says, percent change of vascular volume. And if you lose volume, then your heart rate has to go up. If you have high volume, then things all have to balance out. So this is just a slide showing that the body needs to be balanced. We'll get into this in the cardiac output chapter a lot more with two graphs called the vascular and cardiac function curves. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. This is a slide that talks about what happens to respiratory. How does your breathing tie in with heart rate? The lungs and the heart are connected by the pulmonary artery and pulmonary veins. But how does the breathing and how does the heart rate tie together? So this shows vagus nerve activity, sympathetic nerve activity. They're kind of opposite. We kind of saw that. I'm going to back up on this slide. We saw that those are counteractive. It's like tug of war, sympathetic, parasympathetic. They try to balance a happy tone in the middle. And then this is phrenic nerve activity. So what's the phrenic nerve? Before we talk about it, we have to know what it is.
Is that the one tied to the diaphragm?
It is. So that is the diaphragm. So if we stimulate the phrenic nerve, you will have a breath or a hiccup. I'll take a sidestep for just a moment. It's kind of interesting. When we put pacemakers in you, we put a pacemaking lead in your right ventricle. Occasionally, the right ventricle, it lays right, the lead might be laying real close to the diaphragm, because here, let's look at this RV. Can you guys see me on video? Yeah, I see myself now. Okay, very good, very good. So here's the right heart, and this is the diaphragmatic surface, the inferior wall of the heart. If I put a lead right down here on your right ventricle, which is what we do to pace your ventricle, we put one in the right atrium and right ventricle, and we time them so we got atrial ventricular synchrony. You invasive guys will learn about that later in our heart cath class when you have the EP talks by Jordy Baker. Pacing. So if I'm pacing your right heart, occasionally that shock goes through the wall of the heart and it touches the diaphragm. So every time we pace your heart rate, you get a hiccup. Or you get like a little breath, but it comes out like a hiccup. So that's one of the tests we do when we put a pacemaker in, is we make sure that where our lead is does not stimulate your phrenic nerve essentially and make you have hiccup every time the heart beats. That's just not comfortable. So what we do is we'll just pull the line and move it and maybe put it somewhere else where it's not stimulating the phrenic nerve. So that's one of the tests we do before we sew up the pacer pack and send you on your way. Interesting. So if the phrenic nerve's going on, you're breathing. And if you're breathing, you're getting volume return to the right heart. You got the Bainbridge reflex that's kicking things off to stretch and then tells it, hey, speed up the heart rate. But also, the sympathetic nerves, when the breathing is happening, the sympathetic nerves are active, saying increase the heart rate because we're breathing. So that's two ways that breathing makes your heart rate rise. One is right atrial stretch, Bainbridge. Two is phrenic nerve tied to sympathetic nerve. So when you breathe in, your heart rate goes up by two mechanisms we just learned about. And when the sympathetic's on, the parasympathetic's off. So these guys are like they're one or the other. And this is interplay about breathing. It's kind of a similar slide to what we looked at here. This was about vascular volume and the Bainbridge reflex and the interplays. These are all positive heart rate, and then these leads to negatives. So this is kind of showing us the same thing, but it says your respiratory center in your brain says breathe. It creates a vacuum in your chest. It takes the venous return and makes it increase. That stimulates the Bainbridge reflex. If you put a vacuum in your chest, you get lung volumes increases. If you bring a big venous volume to your heart, you get that moves through and you get a big rise in pressure out in the arteries, and that basically makes the baroreceptor pressures. The brain says, hey, I don't want all that pressure, let's slow it down. So there's all these back and forths. Baroreceptors typically are going to lower your pressure when you have high pressure in your brain. Bainbridge reflex says, I got volume coming into my right atrium, I need to speed up to move that volume through. When you breathe, your brain knows there's more volume coming into your chest, more blood will get sucked in with the vacuum. Let's move it out. Let's get increased heart rate with phrenic nerve activity. So these are some of the pluses and minuses. Now, what happens when you start thinking about chemoreceptors? So this is oxygen and CO2 receptors. Heart rate. With respiration, there's chemoreceptors. And so chemoreceptors are sensing oxygen. And if you have low oxygen to your brain will tell your phrenic nerve, give me a long, deep breath because I need more oxygen. So it'll increase the frequency and depth of respiration. Kind of makes sense. So this is more about how does your brain regulate breathing, not so much about heart rate. Chemoreceptors, low O to the brain now we just said low O to the brain makes you take a deep breath, but if in severe cases, severe drops, and we're going to learn about mild changes in chemistry and severe changes in chemistry. Severe changes in chemistry actually depresses everything. Mild changes in chemistry stimulates everything. We'll get into that in a little bit. Here's something that's called the dive reflex. They put sensors on these up in Alaska, the University of Alaska at Anchorage. They put little heart rate monitors and depth sensors on these seals, these like aquatic mammals that are going to go dive down and go get the mollusks on the bottom or chase whatever they want to eat. When they dive, their heart rates go really slow. It's called the dive response. And for us, if you take a big breath in and bear down, that puts a lot of pressure on your, like a Valsalva maneuver puts a lot of pressure on your carotid baroreceptors, and your heart rate will drop. So if you take a deep breath and hold it, your heart rate will start dropping. And that shows us, this is an example of an EKG of a paraplegic man where they stopped his ventilator to suction his lungs, and he had a bout of bradycardia. Here's a slide that's not from the book that I added. If we have a pacemaker that has a rate responsive mechanism, one way we can find out that you're not breathing, or one way that we want to manage the rate of the pacemaker is we check the impedance between the lead, which is sewn up here in your chest. Here, I'll take my pacemaker here. When you take a breath in, your heart drops down with your diaphragm. We sew the lead, the battery up here in your chest, and the lead is here at the right ventricle. And when they're distant, you go from like 500 to 800 ohms of resistance. So that's a cyclic regulation of resistance in the electric wires. The farther they are away from each other, the more resistance there is. And so that's one way the pacemaker will know that you're breathing. So if you're starting to breathe more regularly and it sees a more cyclic up and down of the heart, it'll increase your heart rate. So pacemakers will manage your heart rate independently of your body. We put a pacemaker in you. That's one way. Another way is, it's interesting. I'll just use this little stapler as an example. So they have a piezoelectric crystal set up like a diving board in the pacemaker in the battery box. And when you walk or move, it bounces. It's just kind of like moving. It kind of bounces on the end of it. And when it moves, it flexes. What does a piezoelectric crystal do when it gets flexed? Like when a sound wave hits it for you echo guys or vascular, what happens to a piezoelectric crystal when it gets deformed by a pressure wave that is the sound wave hitting it? What does it do? You can take a moment to think about it. I'll take a sip of coffee.
Does it convert it to an electrical signal?
There you go, Joseph. It's the piezoelectric crystal takes electricity. If you charge it, it'll flex, and that creates a sound wave. That's how we can see echo. But in reverse, which is interesting, when it's listening, if a sound wave hits it, it creates a small pulse of electricity, and the pacemaker measures that. So pacemaker can tell when you're moving. If the crystal's flexing, it's making these little voltage changes. The pacemaker senses that. Says, hey, this person must be moving. It's time to increase their heart rate. And then it goes on to say, well, hey, if they're moving and they start breathing deeply, then that's a real exercise. But if they're just moving, but there's no depth of exercise from that voltage ohm reading on the pacemaker lead to battery box measurement, then it got tricked. For example, in Spokane, we have lots of potholes because we have hot and cold sessions here with our temperatures in the spring and fall especially. And so the roads freeze and thaw. They thrust and then they flex and then they break apart. So if you're riding in a car in Spokane in certain roads, you're bouncing around. Your pacemaker says, oh, the guy's got to be exercising. Let's jack his heart rate up. But you're not breathing faster. Then it says, I got tricked, and they'll start slowing your heart rate back down. So it uses double sensing to manage your heart rate, pacemakers do. Okay. They also can use pH sensors as a sign of exercise. You start exercising, your CO2 goes up and your pH will go down to the acidic, but those aren't as easy to manage as just the simple flex of a piezoelectric transducer. They also have tried pressure transducers for for pacemakers, but your body tries to seal them over with a layer of endothelium, and then it basically blocks the sensors, so they don't work very good. Anything you put in your body, it always tries to wall it off and encapsulate it. So these are the way pacemakers, we would take a pacemaker. I thought I might have one sitting around here. I guess I don't. And we would engineer a heart rate response by those mechanisms I just told you. So summarizing, sympathetic nervous system makes your heart rate, everything over here is up. Sympathetic nervous system makes your heart rate go up. And I'll just stay on the upside. When you take a big breath in, the phrenic nerve's active, that makes your heart rate go up. If you have mild hypoxia, that makes your heart rate go up. If you have mild elevated CO2, which is called hypercapnia or acidosis, that would make your heart rate go up. If I gave you a drug called epinephrine, that would make your heart rate go up because it directly stimulates the sympathetic. If I gave you a drug called atropine, it basically cuts the brakes, vagolytic, that makes your heart rate go up. And then the Bainbridge reflex, which is that heart rate stretch thing, that makes your heart rate go up. So those are all things that make it go up. Things that make it go down, the carotid and aortic arch, and then the LV wall stretch receptors. They typically, if you have higher blood pressure, they make your heart rate go down. The phrenic nerve, when it's not active, you have a decreased heart rate, like that's the dive response, holding your breath, like I showed you. I told you earlier, but we didn't have graphs. These graphs don't show it that well, but mild oxygen or CO2 or pH disturbances increase your rate, but severe disturbances will depress. So there's mild will increase, severe disturbances in chemistry will depress your functions. And then if I give you propranolol, it slows your heart rate, beta blockers. Okay? So what happens to your heart rate if I give you epinephrine? You can give me the thumbs up or the thumbs down. It should go up. What if I give you atropine? It should go up. What if I give you propranolol? It should go down. What if I stretch your LV with pressure? That means your brain says, I got more pressure up here. It wants it to drop. It doesn't want all that pressure. It's protection. What if I stretch your right atrium with a volume surge? That's the Bainbridge. It's going to make your heart rate go up to get it out of there. What if I reduce the pressure of your carotid baroreceptors? I gave you nitroglycerin, you have low, low, low pressure. Low pressure, low, low, low pressure. Brain wants pressure, it'll make your heart rate go up. The brain wants what it wants. It's don't get confused by trying to out-talk yourself. The brain is greedy. It wants what it wants. If it doesn't have pressure, it wants pressure. So what do you do to get pressure? More heart rate. Make sense? Then now you don't have to memorize this, like it makes sense. Okay. What if I increase your aortic pressure? I gave you epinephrine and I made your aortic pressure rise. It's going to lower your brain doesn't want all that pressure, so it'll lower your heart rate. Very good. What if I gave you a mild hypoxic session? Your SATs went from 95 down to 80. That should increase. A mild chemistry change will cause an increase. What if your SATs went down to 50? You're like severely hypoxic. That's going to depress you. And then mild CO2 will cause increase. Mild pH will cause increase. And both of these severes will cause decreases. What if I have you take a breath in? What does that do? The active inspiration should increase your heart rate. What if I stimulated your phrenic nerve? That should increase your heart rate. Yeah, very good. So that's the end of that one. This one's about force. If you don't mind the outside noise, we can leave it. Otherwise, I'll let Sarah decide if she wants to close it because she's the closest to it. So this is about, so we're kind of separating rate and force. Now we'll talk about force. But Sarah, if it doesn't bother you, it bothers me. Could you close the door? My threshold was exceeded for outside noise interference. Thank you. So the main way that your body rate responds to force changes is the stretch of the myofibrils. Dr. Limegerber taught us that really good. Wasn't that really nice to have him come teach us last week? Think how much we could learn if he taught us every day. For God's sakes, we'd all be physicians. We would be. Yeah. That's what a taste of medical school seems like. And that was pretty good. Also, he really cares, and I wrote him a nice thank you email, and he said he really enjoyed teaching you guys, although he missed seeing you face to face. He missed that personal experience. Yeah. So basically, Starling's. Oh, and I thought Frank Starling was one guy. I thought that was one. Did you guys all think that was one person? He added that he always tweaks his talks. He never like leaves them the same every year. He's always tweaking them. So he must have done a little research on that and found out there was two different guys. So that was something new. I didn't know that. See, I learned something. I always learn something when I listen to Dr. Limegerber. So, stretch it kicks hard. It's like a rubber band. There's something called the TREP phenomenon. We'll look at that. We're going to look at chemicals, humors. So the chemicals from the kidneys, the thyroid, and the pancreas, and we'll also look at blood gases. What are these? How do these things change your force? And we just looked at blood gases being oxygen and CO2 on the rate side of it. An easy way to remember it for you is they're all the same. Force and the rate are together with all those O2, CO2, and pH. So there's this thing called Starling's law. If you stretch the heart out, it'll kick harder. If you keep stretching it, the volume in the chamber, you keep stretching it, then you start getting wet lungs, and now the patient's short of breath and you went too far. So too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So the Starling law only takes us so far. And this is a really good, right there. This is a quote. This is a quote that I got from Dr. Limegerber, but that's a really good full-length version of the Starling's law. We can say quickly, you stretch it, it kicks harder, but that's more profound. That's a more educated statement. The heart has the ability to vary its force of contraction on a beat-to-beat basis, depending on the end diastolic pressure and diastolic volume or the myofibril stretch. Getting hot? We can open a window. Okay. No. So what happens if I give you a norepinephrine? It increases the inotropic state. It increases the heart rate, but it also increases the force of contraction. So here's LV pressures, and then this is, I can't really read it, it's too far away from me. But I have it here. Stroke work. So stroke work is how many joules of output or watts of work is the heart doing per beat. So, if you give it norepinephrine, it's like taking that pressure volume loop Limegruber showed us the other day when we were doing these things. And diastolic pressure curve and systolic pressure curve, and we were doing the box here like this. Well, giving norepinephrine would make this line go further, so you get more stroke volume. Okay. This one says norepinephrine effects infusion leads to increased inotropic state, and we're measuring the DPDT, the change in pressure over change in time, which is on the DPDT. If I look at your LV contraction, it's the slope of isometric contraction. How fast does the heart generate pressure? That's a very good measurement of contractility, or essentially force. And it shows that it's linear. They kept giving the dose higher and higher. And the identity line here is a ratio, not quite 1, but it's fairly linear. If you keep giving more, you get more force. That's what this graph is showing. So your body uses adrenaline. Norepinephrine is a synthetic form of adrenaline that we can make and put it in an IV bottle and drip it to you. If you're having heart failure, we can give you a little drip of epi, and it'll make your heart beat stronger. If we get your pressure where we want it, that's the right amount of epi. If the pressure goes too high, because it's linear, we went too far, we can cut back our dose. Your pressure starts dropping. If we cut it back too far, pressure drops too far, get a little bit more, and we find the sweet spot. That's called titrating our dose. Did you guys learn about titration in your IV class? Titrating drug doses? Maybe, maybe not.
No.
Well, when we're trying to manage somebody's blood pressure, if it's low, we're messing with epinephrine. If the pressure's too high, we're messing with nitro. And so we kind of keep elevating or dropping the amount we give you in little drips per minute until we get you into that sweet spot on the pressure where we want it, a systolic of above 100. So the doc would say, titrate your drug. You start this IV drug and titrate it to a systolic pressure of 100. So the nurse doesn't have to call the doctor every time they need to change the drug dose and ask for their permission. He just said, keep messing with it till you get to a pressure of 100.
Do you have a bag of each hanging?
They typically would, they could have a bag of each, but yes, sometimes we do. Sometimes we're manipulating both because we like the nitro for afterload reduction, but the epi's also, so nitro's afterload reduction here, and then epi's crank on this. So we might be manipulating, and we might be managing your vascular volume. We will be managing all three. What's your vascular volume? What's your nitrate status? And the way we know your vascular volume is by looking at your EDP of your heart. If you have a swan in, we can see your CVP of your right heart, right atrial pressure, and then the wedge pressure. That lets us know where you are on the preload. And then we look at your systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure from your cuff and the aorta. That lets us know where you are on the afterload. And the contractility, we really don't measure your DPDT that's not something we just measure, but we know that if we give you more inotrope, you get a snappier kick. So yeah, that's a good question. We might manage all three at the same time. So we're manipulating all three of those major preload, afterload, and contractility to manage a failing heart. And I think Dr. Limegruber talked a little bit about that on drugs to manage heart failure at the end of his talk last week, didn't he? Yeah. So now when you're in the lab, you see the doc, what's this? What's this parameter? Okay, change this drug. Now you'll kind of get a reason why they're doing it. Oh, there's something new. This is this person, Trepp, developed this theory and figured out that if your heart rate goes really fast, you end up having an increased inotropic state. You get a big burst of tachycardia, you'll end up with a residual increased inotropic state. And that's because when the heart's going back and forth so fast, calcium gets trapped. It can't get back out of the cell. So there's more calcium. The actin and myosin are sticking together stronger. So it's residual calcium that's stuck inside the cell. And so really burst of fast rate leads to increased force. That's called the TREP or staircase phenomenon. I don't know that we do much with that. That's not really that relative to us clinically. Someone has a burst of tachycardia, we aren't going to be worried, oh, they've got increased force for the next few minutes. It just happens. Calcium can't keep up with all the gate changes. Sarcoplasmic reticulum in and out and outside and inside. Calcium builds. If you have more calcium, if we give you calcium, can give you calcium. We used to use calcium a lot more as an inotropic drug, but there's some bad side effects. So now we don't use it so much, but we do give you calcium channel blockers to make your heart beat less forcefully if you're having angina to kind of calm you down. But anyway, this is the TREP reflex. If you have a fast heart rate, you have more calcium in the cell, increased contraction because actin and myosin are sticking together. And there's just showing after 7 fast beats, there's more calcium in the cell. It's an exercise response.
So if someone went like in and out of SVT, would they be on a calcium channel blocker more than one?
You know, they might. The calcium channel blocker can help keep you from having arrhythmias. And so that is an antiarrhythmic drug, and it can protect you from that. Yes, we would use calcium channel blockers to protect you from arrhythmias, or also to help lower your blood pressure. So it's arrhythmic, antiarrhythmic, and antihypertensive. Here's effects of CO2. Mild changes causes increase. Major changes causes decrease. This graph actually shows the mild and major response that I talked about before with heart rate. But this is showing CO2, a mild change in CO2 versus major changes. And pH, if you manipulate the pH, if you stop breathing, what happens to your CO2? It rises. And CO2 and pH are opposite. They're like teeter-totters. So if you stop breathing, your oxygen drops, your CO2 rises, it builds up a waste product, and then your pH will drop. You become acidic. And shows the function of the heart with a pH that's almost normal and one that's very acidic. The heart gets depressed with acidic conditions. Okay, this is a summary slide. So what happens to force if I give you epinephrine? It rises. What happens to force if we have a burst of tachycardia and the TREP phenomenon is kicking in? Increased calcium, increased force. If I gave you elevated calcium, we don't give calcium to people anymore. But if we did give you calcium, then you'd have increased contractions. What we didn't show on the slides, but all of these things, pituitary glands from your brain, adrenal cortical stimulation from your kidneys or your deep inside your kidneys in the medulla, or thyroid glands, hormones, or insulin, which is sugar, or glucagon, which is sugar, all those things make your force rise. So all these hormones will make your force rise. There's a condition called hyperthyroidism. Have you guys ever heard of it? And sometimes people have these like extra growth in their thyroid, and they'll actually, one of my girlfriends in high school, she had a big scar on her neck, and they said, well, what was that? And she said, well, I had a thyroid issue. They had to take out some of my thyroid when I was a kid. And so they leave these big scars on their neck. What is the signs of that? You have a hyperactive person, and the thyroid is kind of like your metabolic rate. And if you have a hyperthyroidism, you have really fast heart rate, you use a lot of calories, you're burning a lot of energy, you're hyperactive in the brain. And so that's not so good. On the other side, we have people come in with hypothyroidism. If you have high thyroid, they can put these little radioactive pellets and kill part of your thyroid or cut part of it out. If you have low thyroid activity, which is also something hypothyroidism, then the patient comes in sluggish, tired, feeling cold, putting on weight, not really burning the food that they ate. And we can just give them Synthroid, which is synthetic thyroid medicine, and bring elevate their metabolism, get them back to normal. They also come in with really low heart rate. So sometimes we get a patient who comes in with bradycardia. We say, well, what's going on? Why do they have bradycardia? One things they'll do is a blood test and see what is your thyroid level. If it's low, hey, that's an easy fix. We give you some thyroid hormone and your heart rate comes back up and everything is resolved. So that's something that relates to cardiology. It would be more of, it's called endocrinology. An endocrinologist dealing with all your glands and hormones. That's a subspecialty in medicine. But we end up seeing hypothyroidism in cardiology, not infrequently. Okay. LV stretch being Starling, that would increase force, mild reductions of oxygen or mild elevations of CO2 or mild drop of pH causes increased force and severe decreases. There's not a lot that drops your force except like beta blockade, right? Or severe chemo abnormalities. So that's it. I think that's the end of it. Oh, we'll ask these questions now. So what if I say I gave you some anterior pituitary hormone? What would that do? What if I gave you insulin, glucagon? What if you got hormones from your kidney, which are usually trying to speed things up, or thyroid? All these things are positives. This whole page is positives. What would happen if, well, pretty much, let's see that. If I give you the TREP response, why do you have more force with the TREP? What's the mechanism? It's extra calcium that was trapped outside of its place. Propranolol, would that increase your force? That's about the only thing we learned, one of the only things that would reduce the force. High serum calcium, what would that do to your force? That should raise it. If you had low humors, low hormones, that should decrease your force. Mild hypoxia, that should increase force. Severe chemical imbalance, that should reduce it. And if I took the pressure away from your LV and I dropped its vascular volume, so I took the wedge pressure and I dropped it from 20 down to 10, what would that do to your force? That would be Starling's law, and it would decrease the force. Yeah, very good. So that's kind of it for that. That's pretty straightforward, I thought. Of all these, this is very binary. It's plus or minus. And then you just kind of need to know some of the mechanisms, the Bainbridge and the TREP and Starling's. Pretty much a lot of what it's going to be a binary test. It's up or it's down. Pretty easy to write that one. And probably pretty easy to take that one. Yeah, so okay, all right. Any other questions from anybody? So we have, for the invasive guys, we have our vascular access and our hemodynamics test after lunch today. And then I'll prime you up on coronary anatomy the next unit when we finish after we review the test. And for all the rest of you vascular and echo guys, I'll have an online test for you like usual on Thursday, and have a good day and a good week, and I'll see you all the vascular echo guys, I'll see you next week, and we're going to get into things that relate to compliance and arterial pressure, pulse pressures, and we get into the microcirculation and lymphatics. And we talk about how does your body manage its protein balances, albumin, colloidal balances. How does it manage its vascular volume with using plasma proteins, like for burn victims and wound victims, things like that? Seems that's what we're getting into next week. Seems like I was going to tell you guys today, and it's just right there, and I can't quite get it. Oh well, I guess it's just lost. It's out there. It's nebulous. I can't find it to bring it to share with you. I asked them to fix the registration problem. It sounds like they're working on it. You guys for echovascular, they'll give you some item numbers and class numbers to register for fall and summer. And we're doing that for invasive. So go ahead. You have a question about that?
Well, I checked on the calendar, and I don't know if this has any bearing or not, but it says that registration is not until May 17th.
Yeah, they let us register early because we are programs and they want to make sure we get what we want. So they kind of let us in first. That's why we're registering now. If you waited, if you register later, it'll still work. But they kind of like us all to register together so that if there's any problems, they get it all figured out together like we're having now. So yours, it could have been a single class that wouldn't let you register. Were you able to register for others?
I couldn't do any of them.
I told them it was, yeah. They said, oh, you can just have the person give me a call and we'll do an add drop form. I'm like, no, you don't want to do that for 28 people. There's something wrong in the system.